So my name is Yuchi. I am currently a joint PhD student from Curtin University in Australia and Tongji University in China. Before I move on to the main slides, I would like to say a few more words about myself. So first, I would like to thank all of the mentors in our research groups and also all the collaborators as shown here, people conducting the project I'm gonna show today. My supervisors in Curtin are Professor Zheng Xiangli and Professor Christopher Elders, and my supervisor in Tongji is Professor Lei Shao. My PhD projects mainly focus on the formation and provenance evolution of the South China Sea as a typical Western Pacific marginal basin. In my study, both onshore outcrops and offshore drill hole samples will all be collected within the South China Sea basin and its surrounding area. So my topic for today's seminar is sedimentary records from Hengchun accretionary prism turbidites on Taiwan Island, implication on late Neogene migration rates of the luzon subduction system. I feel very happy to have this great opportunity to share part of my research here, and thank you all gathering here for my presentation. Next, I would like to give my talk based on these 5 subsections, so including the geological background and the scientific meanings, all the key questions and aims, the samples and methods we use, what data and results have we got, and finally, the main conclusions. So as we usually know, an accretionary prism is often formed by the frontal accretion near the subduction zone. The marine sediments are scraped off the downgoing slab or fore-arc underplating at the conversion margins. What we are talking about here, the Taiwan Island, is just a typical accretionary wedge. And this area is well known for the complicated geodynamic processes between the Eurasian plate and the Philippine Sea plate. To be in detail, the South China Sea stopped its seafloor spreading at about 16 million years ago, and then it began to subduct eastward under the moving Philippine Sea plate along the Manila Trench. The accretionary prism and Luzon fore-arc basin were then generated. This accretionary prism began to grow in size, college and uplift when the Luzon arc encroached upon or collided with the Eurasian continent. We can see that this collision goes on in an oblique direction, so the Taiwan orogenic belt is gradually moving southward. That means in the northern area, the high mountains were first generated, which were followed by the uplifting in the south. So what we are focusing on here is the Hengchun Peninsula, which lies in the southernmost area of the entire Taiwan Island, and also lies to the north of the Manila Trench between the northern South China Sea and the Philippine Sea plate. The most prominent feature of the Hengchun Peninsula is that it widely formed thick successions of deep marine accretionary prism turbidite sandstones during the Miocene. And until about 0.5 million years ago, during the Pleistocene, Hengchun Peninsula started to develop reef limestone structures. This means that the actual exposure timing of the Hengchun Peninsula is fairly late compared to the other parts of the Taiwan Island. And this area is much less affected from the following metamorphism or other reshaping activities. So the turbidites identified here is of great significance for further understanding on the deep water sedimentary and effluent processes in the northern South China Sea area. So here, I will first show you some solid geological evidence. As you can see in the first picture, there are typical deep marine sandstone and mudstone interlayer sedimentary structures, which were broadly formed within the Hengchun accretionary prism turbidites. And in part of the Hengchun area, as you can see in the second picture, there are thick successions of debris flow, which is another kind of gravity flow. It represents a kind of rapid transport process and doesn't show any apparent sedimentary beddings. This picture shows in these gravity flows, there are sharp contact between the bottom mudstone layer and the overlying sandstone layer. For these deep marine turbidite sediments, we particularly notice that there are large abundance of good rounded conglomerate layers. These conglomerates are mostly deposited in the form of inverse or normal grading patterns. And also to be noted, these conglomerates are accumulated within the basal layer of the turbidites, and to some degree have imbricate stacking structures. Briefly, from the bottom to the upper, the classical Balmer sequence are termed as the TA, B, C, D, and E layers, which are the major sedimentary feature of the turbidites. First, you can see an entire Balmer structure in the first picture. Most of the conglomerates are clustered in the TA layer as they are mainly basalts and gabbros. Also in the upper sandstone layer, besides the classical parallel beddings and sandy ripples, as you can see in these pictures, there are deep marine fossil traces and convolute beddings. Of course, we should not ignore other types of gravity flows in the turbidites, such as what we just mentioned, the debris flow in the last slide, and also shown here, the pilobasalts, etc. However, in terms of the provenance and formation process of these turbidites, there are still many controversies among different scholars. Here, I show some major arguments for you based on my current literature review. Some people use paleocurrents and elemental geochemical data and believe that the South China coastal line had extended far more outside than the present configuration during the late Miocene. These people consider the Hengchun area was receiving heterogeneous sedimentation from the coastal South China, transported by Minjiang River, Jiulongjiang River, etc. However, other researchers also found geological evidence of the north or northwestward paleocurrent directions, such as in this model. These people consider the Hengchun was first supplied with an eastward transport and then changed into a northward direction by the subsequent tectonic activities. Although both of them are all lacking reliable evidence, we still cannot help to consider whether there might be totally different source areas. Meanwhile, when we just re-investigate the original provenance, we found that the detrital zircon, uranium, and lead dating spectra of the Minjiang and Jiulongjiang rivers do show certain distinction compared to the final deposition of the Hengchun turbidite sandstones. But do not worry, this point I will discuss in more detail in the next few slides. Anyway, without the single coastal South China province, and consider there are other possible sources controlling the Hengchun Peninsula. Also, I just addressed a lot on the mafic conglomerates clustered within the basal layer of the Balmer sequence. Hopefully you guys have not forgot too much about those rounded pebbles. Unsurprisingly, their formation is also in debate and scholars have not reached a clear conclusion. One of those point of view is that they derive from the product of the South China Sea oceanic crust northward, abducting upon the South China continent during Oligocene to Miocene, while some people rather believe it came from the nearby Philippine Sea plate. A recent model shows, as you can see in this figure, the Hengchun mafic pebbles are part of the seamounts on the oceanic crust. With the continual eastward subduction of the South China Sea, part of the seamounts was experiencing serious erosion or abrasion in the subducting channel, and finally being incorporated into the accretionary prism near the Manila Trench, combined with the classic sediments from the South China. However, the truth is, given the potential provenance distribution patterns, how did those mafic pebbles enter the normal deep sea turbidites, being deposited as one part of the sedimentary structure? It seems that previous suggestions or conclusions are less plausible and needs a better explanation. So the problems above lead us to reconsider the following two main questions. The first one is, what are the exact provenance of the thick-bedded turbidity sandstones on the Hengchun Peninsula? And second, how were the mafic good roundness pebbles formed? And what mechanisms are responsible for the deposition of those pebbles as the basal layers within Hengchun turbidite sequences? According to the questions above, here I would like to briefly introduce our samples and methods. Basically, we carried a deep geological field trip on the Hengchun Peninsula. Our samples include both scientific or commercial drilling samples, as well as the outcrops, in addition to the compiled published data across a wide region of the northern South China Sea. Our lab work mainly include whole rock elemental geochemistry, zircon, uranium, and lead geochronology studies, and petrographic identification. You can see the yellow stars are some representatives of the published data, while the red stars show certain examples in this study. Altogether, we just aim to reconstruct a more detailed source to sink provenance analysis for the Hengchun turbidite sections. So now, let's take a careful look at our results and interpretation. First of all, we conducted zircon, uranium, and lead dating and whole rock elemental geochemical studies on the mafic good rounded conglomerates within the Hengchun turbidite sandstone sequences. According to the petrographic identification results as shown in these figures, as you can see the holocrystalline gabbros with poiculated textures, where ideomorphic plagioclase is enclosed by the pyroxene crystals and shows some reaction ring textures. So below are petrographic studies for the basalts, but I'm not going to go further deeper on the description. But you could also notice the intergranular or intercertal basalt textures. But most importantly, our zircon, uranium, and lead dating results clearly show here that all of the crystallized ages are of 25 to 23 million years. These ages are closely related to the South China Sea spreading history. In more detail, coincided with the ages assigned by the magnetic anomaly stripe of C8 to C6b. Also, from the north to the south, we have conducted whole rock elemental geochemical studies on the basic conglomerate samples in the Qingmount, Sichuan Creek Valley, Qingwashi, and Dajianshan Mountains. As you can see in the right figure, except few samples, most of them just commonly show apparent mid-ocean ridge basalt distribution patterns that are amoral EMO features, indicating the normal oceanic crust materials instead of the dominance of the OIB distribution pattern of the seamount chains. So next it comes to the Detrital, zircon, uranium, and lead age spectra of the turbidity sandstone samples. Basically, there are several key points we could summarize from our results. First, these samples are all characterized by apparent early Yanshanian and Indocenian peaks, as well as relatively large groups of Asian detrital zircons, such as Proterozoic or Archean ages. Second, which is very important, these sandstone samples all display very high peaks of Cenozoic ages, clustered at about 25 to 23 million years. These ages are totally inconsistent with the Cenozoic crystallized ages of the basalt and gabbro pebbles, which have close affinity to the South China Sea oceanic crust. And just remember, I just mentioned in the last two slides, these discoveries indicate that the broken oceanic crust were easy to erode or weather, and to a certain degree has provided part of classic materials to the Hengchun turbidite sequences. As most of people know, the South China Sea extended during about 33 million years to 50 million years ago. However, those pebbles finally incorporated into the Hengchun accretionary prism turbidites are mainly at the age of Upper Oligocene. The relatively more reasonable explanation is that for the South China Sea oceanic crust, only is C8 to C6b, this kind of magnetic anomalous part, eventually enter into the accretionary prism turbidites. In brief, we divide our potential provenances into three parts to discuss according to the geographical locations and spectral features. First, let's take a look at the sediments carried by the rivers across the coastal South China, including the Minjiang River, Jiulongjiang River, and the Ojiang River. They all display prominent middle Yanshan peaks. As for Minjiang River, in addition to the relatively high Yanshan cluster, the Caledonian Peak is the major one and is standard at about 435 million years, as well as a very small group of Proterozoic detrital zircons. However, when we look at the Luzon Island to the further south, the sediments carried by its northern rivers show a dominant single age peak at about 18 million years, a relatively rather young Cenozoic age. So now let's move on to the western areas. Is there any possibility that the northern South China Sea basement ever supplied the Hengchun turbidites with any materials? According to our International Ocean Drilling Program BOHO results, all of samples, including the site U1499 and site U1435, are featured by a predominant Yanshan peak during the early Cenozoic. This indicates that during the early rifting stage of the South China Sea, its basement mainly serves as a local or nearby provenance. When we turn to the Hainan Island, its northern rivers commonly show a bimodern pattern, with a major Indocenian peak and a secondary late Yanshan one. I'm not sure whether you have forgot too much about the Hengchun turbidite sandstone patterns, but I would like to remind you of its complex spectra, which are totally different from the ones we are talking about here. However, according to our research and increasing published data in recent years, we are gaining deeper understanding on the Pearl River and other long-distance fluvial systems within the northern South China Sea. To begin with, I would like to briefly introduce the Pearl River. So the modern Pearl River is a continental scale drainage network, and it is the third largest river in China in addition to the Yangtze and Yellow River. According to previous work, the Pearl River has experienced a gradual headwater erosion process into the extensive hinterland of the South China continent, from a very constrained drainage basin to the final continental scale. Basically, it established its general framework very close to the modern shape until the early Miocene and stayed quite stable around and after the middle Miocene. So now we return back to the discussion here. You can see both drilling samples of the middle Miocene Pearl River sediments and the modern estuary show a very broad detrital zircon age patterns. They are completely different from the characteristics of the other sources we just talked about. You can see that the Pearl River system has a dominant Yanshan peak in addition to the subordinate Indocenian Caledonian clusters and limited Precambrian zircons. However, in terms of another drilling site, W1, this borehole sample also display a complex age spectral pattern. Please pay attention here. This drill hole is away from the Pearl River submarine delta and Hainan Island, and it is actually located on the southern margin of the northern South China Sea area. Basically, it consists of a very high early Yanshan and Indocenian peaks, and its Caledonian peak is relatively larger than the Pearl River system. It also shows more Asian Proterozoic and Archean zircons. This W1 lower Miocene sample, to a certain degree, implies a different provenance pattern and sedimentary process dominating the extensive western area of the northern South China Sea, which we could probably have ignored in the previous time. I will show you more details in the next section. The IODP scientific program conducted its 367 and 368 expeditions during 2018. You can see their drilling locations in here, and we conducted uranium and lead dating analysis on the upper Miocene turbidite sandstone samples of the site U1500. These samples show more apparent Indocenian and Caledonian peaks, with modest number of Proterozoic and Archean zircons. Apparently, although we have pointed out specific features of different provenances in such a broad area, there is still too much information for us to figure out. Therefore, we carried out the MDS analysis, which is short for multiple dimensional scaling plot, to help generalize a clearer understanding. As you can see here, both the Pearl River and the western source are quite close to the IODP drill hole samples. And this means the results of these samples are relatively close correlated. In the meantime, the turbidite sequences now outcrop on the Hengchun Peninsula are also closely associated with them. So, what kind of sedimentary and infilling processes and possible geotectonic activities cause this relationship? Here, I would like to say more words on the novel term of a Western provenance I mentioned in the last slide. Besides the evolution story of the large-scale Pearl River system, we discovered an axial eastward flowing drainage, paleo drainage since at least the very, very early Oligocene, possibly prior to the South China Sea opening. This river transported large abundance of terrigenous materials from a western source, including the quantum massif of the Indochina, the western South China Sea paleo uplifts via Yinghehai and Qingdongnan Basin, all the way eastward into the Baiyun Depression of the southernmost of the northern South China Sea. Therefore, this paleo river was named as the Quantum Yingqiong River. As for the well-known Red River, it possibly developed until the very late stage of the late Miocene, even Quaternary period. On the other hand, the Pearl River to the north gradually grew bigger and bigger, and finally formed large-scale submarine delta fans, even stretching into the Baiyun Depression of the northern South China Sea. So you can see from the Oligocene to early Miocene, both the Pearl River and the Quantum Yingqiong River to the west commonly controlled or affected the deep sea provenance distribution pattern. With the progressive transgression after the South China Sea seafloor spreading, this eastward flowing Quantum Yingqiong River was also gradually submerged underwater, but it still delivered large volume of the classic sediments from the west heights as a type of rapid turbidity current. As for the present central canyon, originated since the late Miocene, just lies from the Yinghehai to the Qingdongnan Basin. This geological structure is very likely to be the relic part of the Paleo Quantum Yingqiong River, as shown on our seismic profiles, which I'm not gonna go further deeper on this point, but another only thing to mention is that this canyon was also likely to be affected from the sediments dumped from the Hainan Island when it traveled to the east. So now we go back to the IODP drill hole samples. According to the biostratigraphic framework based on foraminifera and calcareous nanofossils, this area was deposited 100 meters of the turbidite sandstones, characterized by typical deep sea sedimentary structures as shown here. At the bottom layer of these turbidites, we also found large abundance of mafic pebbles, including basalts, and limited amount of gabbros. So based on the experimental results and the source to sink analysis, we aim to reconstruct the sedimentary processes and the eventual formation of the turbidite sequences outcropped on the Hengchun Peninsula area. First, as you can see, these blocks of different colors, they represent magnetic anomalies and the corresponding edges of the South China Sea oceanic crust. With the continuing spread of the crust, the old paths were gradually pushed northward and southward. In our model, heterogeneous sediments delivered by both the Pearl River to the north and the western source suppliers were naturally deposited at the location of the IODP boreholes or its nearby area to develop the thick successions of turbidites we drilled in here. The remaining sediments were carried further eastward under the submarine environment. Please note here, this rapid flowing turbidity current traveled right along the magnetic anomaly stripe of CA to C6b. And the location is just about 17 degree northern latitude as shown in this light blue shade. In the meantime, the turbidity current strongly eroded the seriously broken parts of the upper Oligocene South China Sea oceanic crust, and then entrapped those mafic materials. Correspondingly, their roundness was also increased during this process. Combined with the other long-distance transport sediments, they all together generated the accretionary prism turbidites near the Manila Trench. I have to address one point here. The complex melange structures near the Manila Trench also include other basic conglomerates and the slump deposits. But what our main contact is to investigate the part of turbidite successions. Due to the clockwise northwestward drifting of the Philippine Sea Plate, the original accretionary prism migrated and eventually exposed in the Hengchun Peninsula region. We also roughly calculate the moving rate of the luzon arc system based on our source to sink model. We adopted the assumption of the paleogeographic locations of the Manila Trench and luzon arc here from Johnny Wu et al. At 2016, and to estimate the whole distance between the original place of the turbidites and the final location of the Hengchun area. From the IODP turbidite deposition area to the Manila Trench only took very short time by the rapid current. So this means that we could use the corresponding edges of the foraminifera identified in the IODP drill hole samples, while the final outcrop time was actually represented by the edges of the reef limestone deposition in the Hengchun area. In this way, although more details and possibilities needs to be considered, we still got our calculation of about 61 to 65 millimeters per year. So our main conclusions can be briefly summarized as follows. The rounded mafic conglomerate class within the Hengchun turbidites show close affinities with the South China Sea mid-ocean ridges of 23 to 25 million years. and the edges are inconsistent with the magnetic anomaly stripe of C8 to C6 distributed at the geographical location of 70° northern latitude. During the late Miocene, heterogeneous sediments from the west, mainly via the Quantum Hengchun River and the Pearl River to the north, combined with the eroded South China Sea oceanic cross clads, were transported to the Manila Trench as part of the accretionary prism. From the late Miocene to Pleistocene, the northwestward drifting of the Philippine Sea Plate, the original accretionary prism migrated and eventually exposed in the Hengchun Peninsula area. The estimated velocity is about 61 to 65 millimeters per year. So that's all for my talk, and thanks to everyone for your listening. I would like to sincerely thank to all of my supervisors and every members in the Curtin and Tongji research groups. And also thanks again to Luke for your time and efforts. Below here just shows some of my publications I mentioned in this presentation. And if you have any other further questions, please feel free to ask me.